Hey my sleepy friends, tonight we're winding back the clock to World War II, but not to talk about battles or generals. No, tonight is all about how soldiers survive the coldest nights. Imagine it's winter, you're far from home, and your only defence against the freezing wind is a wool blanket, a dented tin mug of coffee, and maybe an extra pair of socks if you were lucky. We'll walk through what it felt like to sleep under the stars in the middle of Europe, how soldiers layered up like human onions, and the clever and sometimes ridiculous ways they kept warm. Warning, embracing your companion for warmth was not just a matter of friendship, but also a strategic decision. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Now grab a warm blanket, be sure to turn your lights off and picture yourself beside a flickering campfire. Snowflakes drifting down, boots drying by the fire, and stories quietly shared under the stars. Picture this, you're complaining about your house being 68 degrees instead of 72, maybe grumbling as you reach for that extra blanket. Now imagine it's 1942, you're somewhere in Eastern Europe, and the thermometer has given up trying to measure temperatures that would make a penguin reconsider its life choices. Welcome to the world where winter wasn't just uncomfortable, it was actively trying to kill you. You see, when World War II rolled around, nobody really thought much about the weather. Sure, Napoleon had a minor mishap with the Russian winter in 1812, but that was long ago, right? Modern armies had modern equipment. They had plans, they had confidence. They had no idea how creative you had to be when Jack Frost joined the other team. The thing about military planning is that it's a lot like packing for a vacation. You think you know what you'll need. You make your lists, you feel prepared, and then you arrive to discover you've brought sandals to a blizzard. Except in this case, the consequences of poor packing weren't just uncomfortable, they were potentially fatal. When the first brutal winter hit the European theatre, soldiers discovered something that would make even the most seasoned outdoorsman nervous. The cold wasn't just cold, it was the kind of cold that turns your breath into icicles mid-sentence, that makes metal so brittle it snaps like a pretzel, and that transforms simple tasks like loading a rifle into a finger-numbing exercise in futility. But here's where the story gets intriguing and where you start to see the remarkable ingenuity of people who refuse to let Mother Nature have the last word. When confronted with temperatures so low as to freeze antifreeze, individuals not only endure, but also innovate. You master improvisation, acquire a PhD in adaptability, and become a professor of whatever works. The first lesson these soldiers learned was that the enemy wasn't always wearing a uniform. Occasionally the enemy was invisible, creeping through tent flaps and uniform seams, turning their breath against them, and making every night a battle for survival. The cold became a third party in the conflict, impartial in its cruelty, affecting everyone equally, regardless of which side they were fighting for. Think about your worst camping experience. Maybe that time the air mattress deflated, or when you forgot to pack enough warm clothes. Imagine multiplying that discomfort by approximately 1,000, adding the constant threat of enemy action, and adding the responsibility of ensuring the functionality of your equipment and the survival of your fellow soldiers. And you'll begin to understand the situation. What's remarkable isn't just that these soldiers survived, it's how they turned survival into an art form. They became meteorologists without weather apps, engineers without blueprints, and inventors without patents. Every night became a laboratory for testing new theories about heat retention. Every morning brought lessons in what worked and what left you counting your toes to make sure they were all still there. The standard issue gear quickly proved about as useful as a screen door on a submarine, designed by people who probably tested it in climates as harsh as a suburban backyard in October. Wool uniforms that seemed adequate became insufficient. Boots designed for marching became ice buckets for feet. Tents meant to provide shelter became elaborate ways to concentrate cold air. So what do you do when your equipment fails, your supply lines are stretched thinner than your patience, and the thermometer looks like it's trying to dig to China? You get creative. You start looking at everything around you, not for what it is, but for what it could become. That mess kit isn't just for eating, it's a potential hand warmer. That extra sock isn't just spare clothing, it's insulation for your rifle. That piece of canvas isn't just material. It's the difference between sleeping and freezing. And this is where our story really begins. Not with the grand strategies or the famous battles, but with the quiet moments when ordinary people figured out extraordinary ways to stay alive in conditions that seemed designed to make that impossible. Now, you might think that socks are just socks, those things you lose in the dryer, argue about with your spouse, and occasionally use to dust furniture when nobody's looking. But in the frozen theatres of World War II, socks became currency, lifelines, and the foundation of an entire underground economy that would make Wall Street traders jealous. The first thing you need to understand about feet in sub-zero temperatures is that they're basically traitors. Your body, being the pragmatic organism it is, decides that keeping your core warm is more important than maintaining diplahebus, or in this case under the frostbite. Therefore your feet, along with your fingers, suffer the consequences of frostbite. Trenchfoot became a condition so common that it practically needed its own postal code. Imagine your feet deciding to stage a revolt, swelling up, turning fascinating colours that would make a sunset jealous, and generally make every step feel like walking on broken glass. Now imagine trying to march, run or fight in that condition. It's like trying to dance ballet in ski boots filled with marbles. This is where the Great Sock Conspiracy began. Soldiers quickly realised that the military's approach to foot care was about as sophisticated as using a hammer to fix a watch. The standard issue socks were fine for parade grounds, but about as useful as chocolate teapots when dealing with months of wet, cold conditions. So they improvised, and their solutions would make modern outdoor gear companies weep with admiration. They learned to layer socks like lasagna, thin silk or cotton against the skin, wool for insulation, and sometimes even paper or cloth strips for extra padding. They discovered that changing socks wasn't just hygiene, it was survival. Dry socks became more valuable than cigarettes, and cigarettes were practically currency. But here's where it gets really creative. When fresh socks were in short supply, which was most of the time, soldiers became textile engineers. They learned to dry wet socks using body heat, tucking them inside their uniforms close to their chest while they slept. Imagine spooning with your laundry, but hey, when it's life or death, dignity takes a back-to-memory seat. They also figured out the ancient art of sock rotation. They would maintain a meticulous record of the socks they had worn, those that were drying and those that were clean, much like a sophisticated filing system. Some soldiers developed elaborate schedules that would make a corporate calendar look simple. Tuesday, wear the grey wool, dry the cotton blend, air out the emergency pair. The really clever ones discovered that newspapers, when available, made excellent sock insulation. They'd wrap their feet in newspaper before putting on socks, creating a makeshift vapour barrier that would make modern hiking gear designers nod with approval. Of course, this led to the amusing situation of soldiers literally having yesterday's news in their boots, but when you're avoiding frostbite, you don't complain about the reading material. Some soldiers took the sock science even further, learning to waterproof their footwear using whatever was available. Candle wax, animal fat, even soap. Anything that could create a barrier between their feet and the elements. They became chemists, testing different combinations and sharing successful formulas like state secrets. The sock trade became so sophisticated that units developed their own internal economies. A pair of dry wool socks could be worth a day's rations. Clean socks served as birthday presents, Christmas gifts, and tokens of friendship. Soldiers would literally give you the socks off their feet, though probably not the ones they were currently wearing. And then there were the ingenious innovations in socks. Some soldiers learned to knit, creating custom toile, socks from unravelled sweaters or salvaged yarn. Others figured out how to repair holes using thread pulled from other garments, essentially performing sock surgery by candlelight. But perhaps the most touching aspect of the Great Sock Conspiracy was how it brought people together. Soldiers would share their foot care knowledge like family recipes, passing down the wisdom of keeping extremities warm from veteran to rookie. They'd help each other check for signs of frostbite, assist with the delicate operation of sock changing in cramped quarters, and share the precious resource of dry footwear. The discussion wasn't just about comfort, though comfort was certainly part of it. The debate was about maintaining the ability to fight, march, and survive. Feet were mission-critical equipment, and socks were the maintenance manual. Every dry sock was a small victory against the cold. Every successful foot care routine was a triumph of human ingenuity over hostile conditions. You know how they say 2 heads are better than 1? Well, in temperatures that could freeze your thoughts mid-think, 2 bodies were definitely better than 1. In freezing conditions, the buddy system evolved from simple military protocol to a delicate survival dance that demanded more coordination than a Broadway musical and more trust than a marriage. Imagine trying to explain to your spouse why you need to share a sleeping bag with your co-worker. Now imagine that sharing a bed isn't just a suggestion. It's the difference between waking up tomorrow and becoming a human popsicle. Welcome to the realm of tactical cuddling, where maintaining personal space has become an expensive luxury. The science behind shared body heat is actually pretty straightforward, though the execution could be hilariously awkward. Your body generates heat, about as much as a 100-watt light bulb when you're just sitting around. In normal conditions, most of that heat just wanders off into the atmosphere like an ungrateful teenager. But when you're trying to survive in conditions that would make an Arctic fox shop for a warmer coat, every BTU becomes precious. Soldiers quickly learned that sharing body heat wasn't just about snuggling up. It was about creating a microclimate, a tiny pocket of livable temperature in the middle of nature's deep freeze. They developed techniques that would make efficiency experts proud. 2 soldiers would zip their sleeping bags together, creating what they called a thermal envelope. Sounds fancy, but it was basically an adult sleeping bag built for 2 chilly people. But here's where it gets tricky, and sometimes hilarious. Sharing body heat requires coordination that would challenge a synchronized swimming team. Who sleeps on which side? How do you arrange arms and legs so that nobody's circulation gets cut off? What happens when one person needs to get up in the middle of the night? These became crucial tactical decisions that could mean the difference between a decent night's sleep and waking up more tired than when you went to bed. The rotation system they developed was pure genius. Since the person on the outside of the arrangement naturally got colder, they'd switch positions every few hours. It was like a freezing critical version of musical chairs. Some units developed elaborate schedules, with soldiers taking turns being the outside man and the inside man. Others just switched when whoever was getting colder couldn't stand it anymore. They also figured out the art of the heat exchange. Before settling in for the night, soldiers would do what they called warming exercises, essentially vigorous calisthenics designed to get their blood pumping and their core temperature up. Then they'd quickly get into their shared sleeping arrangements while their bodies still had heat to share. It was like preheating an oven, except the oven was your buddy, and the oven was trying to keep you both alive. The buddy system extended beyond sleeping arrangements. During the day, soldiers would work in pairs to check each other for signs of hypothermia or frostbite. They transformed into amateur medical diagnosticians, adept at identifying the subtle indications that a person was losing their fight against the cold. Slurred speech, confusion, uncontrollable shivering, these weren't just symptoms. They were emergency signals that required immediate intervention. They developed communication systems that worked even when talking became difficult. They developed hand signals, predetermined phrases, and systems for checking in with each other at regular intervals. How are your fingers became as important a question as, what's our position? The answers could determine whether someone was still fully functional or needed immediate help. Some of the buddy system innovations were surprisingly sophisticated. Soldiers learned to share not just body heat, but also the heat generated by their equipment. A small camp stove or heating device could warm 2 people if they positioned themselves correctly and shared the heat efficiently. They'd create windbreaks for each other, taking turns blocking the wind while the other person warmed up. But perhaps most importantly, the buddy system provided psychological warmth. Being cold and miserable alone is one thing. Being cold and miserable with someone else somehow makes it bearable. They'd tell jokes, share stories, and complain together about the conditions. Misery loves company. And in this case, companionship could literally save your life. The trust required was enormous. You had to trust your buddy to wake you up if you showed signs of hypothermia during the night. You had to trust them to share resources fairly, tell you if you were developing frostbite, and help you make the countless small decisions that could mean survival or disaster. In return, you had to be trustworthy yourself, putting your buddy's survival on the same level as your own. If you've ever watched MacGyver and thought nobody could really make a heater out of a paperclip and a stick of gum, then you've never met a World War II soldier facing down a winter that could freeze the enthusiasm right out of an optimist. These guys became the original masters of making something from nothing, turning the phrase "work with what you've got" into a survival philosophy that would make modern survivalists take notes. The first lesson in battlefield heating was that everything, and I mean everything, was a potential heat source. Did you ever have an empty tin can for your lunch? Congratulations, you just found yourself a hand warmer. Those candles you've been saving for special occasions? Every night trying not to become a human ice cube counts as special. The alcohol you've been hoarding for when the war ends? Well, it turns out alcohol burns, and burning things make heat. Who knew? Soldiers became amateur chemists, learning which materials burned cleanest and longest. They discovered that strips of cardboard, when rolled tightly and lit, could burn for surprisingly long periods. paper soaked in melted candle wax became a slow-burning fuel source. They learned to make buddy burners, tin cans filled with rolled cardboard and wax that could provide heat for hours. But the real innovation came in heat distribution and conservation. While creating fire was the initial step, the real challenge was directing that heat to its most beneficial location. Soldiers learned to create heat reflectors using polished metal, mirrors, or even pieces of glass. They'd position these reflectors to bounce heat from small fires back toward themselves, essentially doubling the effectiveness of their heat sources. They also mastered the art of the heat bank. A fire could heat large stones, metal objects, or even their mess kits, which they then used as portable heaters. A hot stone wrapped in cloth could keep hands warm for hours. A heated mess kit could be tucked into a sleeping bag to pre-warm it before bedtime. The group was essentially creating medieval hot water bottles, but without using actual water bottles. Some of the most creative solutions involved repurposing military equipment in ways that would probably violate several military regulations. Empty ammunition boxes became miniature stoves. Discarded helmets became heat reflectors, or even cooking surfaces. They could create structures for holding heat sources, or build makeshift heaters using rifle cleaning rods. The really clever ones figured out group heating systems that would make modern heating engineers jealous. They'd dig small pits in the ground, line them with stones, build fires in them until the stones were thoroughly heated, then cover the coals and use the heated stones as radiant heaters. The thermal mass of the stones would continue to give off heat long after the fire had died down. Body heat amplification became another specialty. They learned to create heat traps using whatever materials were available. They could arrange extra clothing to create air pockets that trapped body heat. Blankets could be rigged to create tent-like structures that concentrated warmth from multiple heat sources. They figured out how to use their breath as a heating system, creating small enclosed spaces where exhaled air could warm incoming cold air. Some soldiers became experts in what they called heat scavenging, finding ways to capture and use heat that was already being generated. If someone was cooking, they'd position themselves to catch the heat from the cooking fire. If equipment was running and generating heat, they'd find ways to benefit from that warmth. No BTU was allowed to escape without being put to good use. The innovation extended to personal heating devices that bordered on genius. Soldiers learned to make hand warmers using metal containers, chemical reactions, or even simple friction devices. They'd create heated insoles for their boots using materials that retained heat. Some figured out how to modify their clothing to create better heat retention, adding layers, creating air pockets, or even rigging up primitive heating systems within their uniforms. But perhaps the most impressive innovations were the ones that solved multiple problems at once. One could use a heat-generating device for cooking, drying damp clothes, melting snow for drinking water, or even for signalling purposes. They weren't just making heaters, they were creating multi-purpose survival tools that addressed several needs simultaneously. The knowledge sharing that happened around these innovations was remarkable. Successful heat-making techniques rapidly disseminated throughout the units. Soldiers would demonstrate their inventions to others, teach their techniques, and continuously improve on each other's designs. It was like an open-source hardware project, except the hardware was keeping people alive. What's truly amazing is how these field innovations often worked better than the official equipment. Standard-issue heating devices, when they existed at all, were often too heavy, too fuel-intensive, or too fragile for field conditions. The soldier-invented alternatives were lighter, more efficient, and built to withstand the kind of abuse that comes with being carried into combat zones. Now, if you think building a blanket fort in your living room makes you an architect, wait until you hear about the subterranean cities that soldiers created when the surface world became too hostile for human habitation. These weren't just holes in the ground, they were sophisticated underground living spaces that would make tiny modern house enthusiasts weep with envy. The inspiration for going underground was pretty straightforward. If the surface temperature was trying to kill you, maybe it was time to accept the Earth's invitation to come inside. Soldiers quickly learned that just a few feet below ground, temperatures were significantly warmer and much more stable. Discovering a natural thermostat that Mother Nature had been concealing was a profound revelation. But digging a hole and calling it home was just the beginning. These underground spaces evolved into complex engineering projects that required skills nobody taught in basic training. Soldiers became excavation experts, structural engineers, and interior designers all at once. They had to figure out ventilation systems that would provide fresh air without letting in deadly cold. They needed drainage systems to prevent their homes from becoming underground swimming pools, and they had to create heating systems that wouldn't asphyxiate them in their sleep. The basic foxhole quickly evolved into something that resembled a studio apartment designed by someone who really understood the importance of thermal efficiency. They'd start with a basic excavation, then line the walls with whatever materials were available: logs, boards, corrugated metal, even a packed snow that would freeze into protective walls. The key was creating insulation between the living space and the surrounding earth. Ventilation was the tricky part. You needed fresh air to breathe, but every opening was a potential heat leak. Soldiers became experts in creating air circulation systems that brought in oxygen while maintaining temperature. They'd create baffled entrances that prevented cold air from flowing directly into the living space. Some developed sophisticated chimney systems that drew smoke out while pulling fresh air in through carefully designed vents. The heating systems they created for these underground spaces were marvels of efficiency. Small stoves made from tin cans or salvaged metal could heat an entire underground room. They learned to position heat sources for maximum efficiency and to create systems that distributed heat evenly throughout the space. Some even figured out radiant heating systems using heated stones or metal objects that would slowly release heat over time. But the real innovation was in space utilization. These weren't just survival shelters, they were livable spaces designed for multiple people to coexist in comfort. They created sleeping areas, common areas, storage spaces, and even workshops where they could maintain equipment or create new survival tools. Some underground spaces included multiple rooms connected by tunnels, essentially creating underground apartment complexes. The construction techniques they developed were surprisingly sophisticated. They learned to create structural supports that could handle the weight of Earth above while providing maximum living space below. They figured out how to waterproof their constructions using available materials. Some even created elevated floors to prevent ground moisture from making their living spaces damp and cold. Furniture in these underground hotels was a triumph of creative repurposing. Empty ammunition boxes became chairs, tables, and storage units. Logs or boards became benches and bed frames. Salvaged materials were transformed into shelving, lighting fixtures, and organizational systems. They were essentially furnished apartments created entirely from military surplus and found materials. The social dynamics of underground living required their own innovations. Multiple people living in small underground spaces needed systems for privacy, organization, and conflict resolution. They developed schedules for sharing common areas, systems for maintaining cleanliness, and protocols for managing the inevitable personality conflicts that arise when you're essentially living in a cave with your co-workers. Some units created underground spaces that were genuinely impressive engineering projects. They'd excavate large common areas that could accommodate entire squads, with separate sleeping alcoves, storage areas, and workshop spaces. These underground complexes included sophisticated drainage systems, multiple heating zones, and even recreational areas where soldiers could relax when they weren't on duty. The decoration of these spaces reveals something touching about the human need for comfort and beauty, even in the most challenging circumstances. Soldiers would bring whatever personal items they could into these underground homes. Soldiers brought photographs, letters, and small mementos that served as reminders of their home. Some created artwork on the walls, carved decorations into wooden supports, or arranged their few possessions in ways that made the space feel more like home and less like a survival bunker. Perhaps most remarkably, these underground spaces became centres of community life. They were where soldiers shared meals, told stories, played games, and maintained the social connections that were crucial for morale. They weren't just surviving in these spaces, they were living, creating small communities that provided warmth, not just for bodies, but for spirits. You might think that eating in sub-zero temperatures is just a matter of opening a can and hoping for the best. But soldiers in World War II's coldest theatres discovered that food wasn't just fuel, it was medicine, a hand warmer, a morale booster, and occasionally the difference between making it through the night and not making it at all. The science of eating to stay warm became as crucial as any military strategy. The first thing these soldiers learned was that their bodies became calorie-burning furnaces in cold weather. Your body exerts significant effort to sustain its core temperature, consuming fuel at a pace that rivals that of a high-performance sports car. A soldier in freezing conditions might burn 4,000 to 6,000 calories a day, about twice what you'd burn sitting at a desk job. But here's the catch. Military rations weren't designed for Arctic conditions, and supply lines in wartime were about as reliable as weather forecasts. so soldiers became nutritional strategists, learning to maximize the warming potential of every morsel of food. They discovered that different types of food generated different amounts of internal heat. Fats and proteins were like throwing logs on your internal fire. They burned slowly and steadily, providing long-lasting warmth. Carbohydrates were more like kindling quick energy that could help when you needed an immediate heat boost. Hot food became medicine. A warm meal didn't just fill your stomach. It raised your core body temperature, improved circulation, and provided psychological comfort that was almost as important as the physical warmth. Soldiers would go to extraordinary lengths to heat their food, creating elaborate cooking systems that could function in the worst conditions. They became masters of what modern campers call one-pot meals, but their versions were far more sophisticated. They learned to create stews and soups that could be cooked efficiently while providing maximum nutritional and thermal benefit. These weren't just random ingredients thrown together, they were carefully planned combinations designed to provide sustained energy and warmth. Some of the food heating innovations were pure genius. Soldiers learned to use heated stones to warm their food, essentially creating prehistoric slow cookers. They'd heat metal objects in fires and use them to warm pre-cooked food. Some figured out how to use the heat from their bodies to slowly warm food over time, essentially wearing their dinner until it was ready to eat. The timing of eating became crucial. A hot meal right before sleep could provide the calories needed to maintain body temperature through the night. Small snacks throughout the day could keep the internal fires burning steadily. They learned to eat strategically, timing their food intake to provide maximum warming benefit when they needed it most. But here's where it gets really interesting. Soldiers discovered that some foods were natural hand warmers. Soldiers could hold hard candies, chocolate, nuts, and other high-energy foods in their mouths or hands to provide both nutrition and localized warmth. A piece of chocolate wasn't just a treat, it was a portable heating element that happened to taste delicious. They also became experts in food preservation in extreme cold. While freezing temperatures created storage challenges, they also provided natural refrigeration that could keep food fresh longer than normal. Soldiers learned to use the cold as a tool, freezing water for later use, preserving food that might otherwise spoil, and even creating makeshift ice boxes for storing supplies. The social aspect of eating in extreme cold conditions was equally important. Sharing hot food became a bonding experience that strengthened unit cohesion. Soldiers would alternate in cooking, exchange recipes and techniques, and ensure equitable distribution of the available hot food. A warm meal shared with comrades provided psychological warmth that was almost as important as the physical calories. Some units developed sophisticated cooking schedules that ensured someone always had access to hot food. They'd stagger their mealtime so that cooking fires were kept going. Throughout the day, this process essentially created a continuous source of heat and warm food. This process wasn't just about nutrition, it was about maintaining a constant source of warmth and comfort. The creativity in food preparation was remarkable. Soldiers learned to make hot drinks from almost anything. Melted snow mixed with whatever flavourings they could find, hot water with dissolved hard candies, even warm broths made from reconstituted rations. These weren't gourmet beverages, but they provided internal warmth and psychological comfort. They also discovered the warming power of spicy foods. They valued anything that could provide them with internal warmth. They treasured anything that could generate an internal heat sensation, including hot peppers, spicy sauces, and even strong alcohol. Some soldiers would save their spiciest rations for the coldest nights, using them as both food and internal heating systems. The most touching aspect of food in these extreme conditions was how it connected soldiers to home. Letters from family often included recipes, suggestions for staying warm, or descriptions of warm meals being prepared back home. Food served as a conduit between the frigid battlefield and the cosy kitchens they recalled, offering a level of comfort that extended beyond mere sustenance. After months of treating every degree above freezing like a personal gift from the weather gods, you might think that the arrival of spring would have been pure celebration. But for soldiers who had spent months becoming master craftsmen of survival, spring brought its own unique challenges, and revealed just how profoundly the experience of extreme cold had changed them. The first warm day was like meeting an old friend you hadn't seen in years. Soldiers would actually stand outside, faces turned toward the sun, trying to remember what warmth felt like on their skin. Some described it as almost overwhelming. After months of associating heat with precious, carefully rationed resources, having unlimited warmth from the sky felt like winning the lottery. But spring also meant saying goodbye to the elaborate survival systems they'd created. Was it time to abandon the carefully engineered underground shelters that had served as homes for months? Time to abandon them. Other sophisticated heating systems, which were crafted from scraps and ingenuity, no longer necessary. They are no longer necessary. We can now pack away the carefully planned clothing systems that had kept the survivors alive through the darkest nights. It was time to pack them away. There was something almost melancholy about dismantling these survival innovations. These weren't just tools, they were the products of creativity, desperation and collaboration that had literally saved lives. Some soldiers kept their homemade heating devices or modified clothing as souvenirs, tangible reminders of what they'd accomplished when everything seemed impossible. The transition to spring weather required its adjustments. Bodies that had adapted to burning massive amounts of calories to stay warm suddenly didn't need that fuel. Circulation systems that had been working overtime to keep extremities functional needed time to readjust. Some soldiers actually felt cold in temperatures that would have seemed tropical during the worst of winter. More importantly, spring revealed the psychological impact of surviving extreme conditions. These soldiers had developed a different relationship with comfort, with warmth, with the simple pleasure of not being cold. Many described never again taking for granted things like warm buildings, hot meals, or simply being able to feel their fingers and toes. The knowledge they'd gained didn't disappear with the snow. Veterans of extreme cold conditions became valuable resources for training new soldiers, passing on the hard-won wisdom of survival in impossible conditions. They taught the sock rotation systems, the buddy heating techniques, the underground construction methods, and the crucial psychology of staying warm when your equipment fails. Some of the innovations that soldiers developed in desperation actually influenced post-war military equipment design. The military started focusing more on cold weather gear, leveraging the hands-on experience of soldiers who had discovered effective solutions when lives were at stake. The gap between what looked good on paper and what functioned in life or death situations had been dramatically revealed. But perhaps most importantly, these experiences created bonds between soldiers that lasted long after the war ended. Men who had shared body heat to survive, who had worked together to build underground shelters, who had created heating systems from scraps. These shared experiences created relationships that transcended normal military camaraderie. Years later, at unit reunions, veterans would still discuss the innovations they'd created, the close calls they'd survived, and the remarkable things they'd accomplished when circumstances forced them to become inventors, engineers, and survival experts. They'd demonstrate their old sock-changing techniques, laugh about the complex methods for sharing body heat, and marvel at their ingenuity. The story of how World War II soldiers survived the coldest nights isn't just about individual survival. It's about what humans can accomplish when they combine necessity with creativity, when they work together toward a common goal, and when they refuse to let impossible conditions defeat them. Every warm sock, every shared sleeping bag, every makeshift heater was a small victory against circumstances that seemed designed to be unbeatable. These soldiers proved that survival isn't just about enduring. It's about adapting, innovating, and maintaining humanity even in the most inhumane conditions. They showed that comfort isn't just about having the right equipment, but about the creativity to make something from nothing, and the wisdom to understand that sometimes the best heating system is another human being who is facing the same challenges you are. So the next time you're adjusting your thermostat, pulling up an extra blanket, or complaining about being a little chilly, remember the soldiers who turned survival into an art form, who made warmth from scraps and ingenuity, and who proved that the human capacity for adaptation and innovation knows no limits, even when the thermometer suggests otherwise. Ultimately, they not only endured the coldest nights, but also conquered them through inventive solutions, and in doing so they left us a legacy not just of military history, but of human resilience, creativity, and the remarkable things that become possible when ordinary people refuse to accept that extraordinary circumstances must defeat them. So how did World War II soldiers survive the coldest nights? Well, let's just say it took a lot of grit, a little luck, and whatever warmth they could scrape together, be it from a frozen can of beans or someone else's socks. Tonight, you bundled up with them, felt the snow seep into your boots, and perhaps even discovered that the term extra blanket sometimes simply referred to wrapping your coat around your knees and hoping for protection. If you're still awake, that's okay. You're not in a trench. There's no frost on your eyelashes or boots to thaw by the fire. You're here, in a warm bed, no helmet required. So let the wind of history settle down, let your breath slow, and just be glad you've got central heating and a blanket that doesn't smell like gun oil. I'll be right here, sipping tea and thinking about how grateful we should be for the little comforts. Sleep well, my friend, and as always, sweet dreams and good night. Island, 5:36, brother Kieran wakes to a half-light seeping through the shutters. Although it is dawn, the sky still wears the same grim shade as it did at dusk. In the monastery kitchen, the last of the winter barley has been ground. The coarse flour barely rises when baked, yielding a handful of firm flatbread. He offers a loaf to a gaunt villager at the gate. The man's trembling hands cradle it as though it were a feast. It is the only food Kieran can spare. All around Cloyne Moor the fields lie barren. By Beltane they should be green with new barley, but instead patches of stunted sprouts struggle from cold, blighted soil. A ragged woman clutching a silent, hollow-eyed child begs Kieran for help. He closes his eyes in pained prayer, knowing the monastery's granary is almost empty. All winter there were whispers that the sun's light had changed. Even now in spring it glows weakly, more grey than gold, giving no warmth. At midday the villagers found no shadows following their feet on the ground. Frosts came hard even after Imbolc, blackening the early shoots. Kieran crosses himself, recalling tales of the biblical plague of darkness, but that lasted only 3 days, whereas this malaise drags on week after the week. Some of the older monks murmur that it's as though the sky itself is a hide stretched over the sun, a perpetual eclipse. At times a fine grey haze drifts through the air, carrying a bitter smell. It has brought hunger and despair to their land, regardless of its cause. To Kieran, it feels as like the very air has turned against them. In the village, cattle low with hunger. Many were slaughtered months ago because there was no hay. The usual cheerful birdsong of spring is muted. Some mornings, thick dew lies frozen on the thatch, unheard of this late in the year. That afternoon, Kieran ventures to the village chapel. Inside, it is crowded with peasants seeking solace. The air is heavy with sweat and fear. He raises his hands and speaks of Job's trials, of keeping faith through hardship. As he prays, his voice wavers. He notices an old man in the back not genuflecting, one of the few who still cling to the old druidic ways. The old man's eyes are clouded with accusation. "Where is your god of light now?" the elder croaks when the prayers end. Nuada's silver hand would sooner bring back the sun than these Latin words. A few villagers nod, desperate for any remedy. Rumours swirl of ancient rites on the hill, offerings to appease whatever spirit has devoured the sun. Kieran feels a spark of anger, but mostly pity. In this dark time, people grasp at any hope. That evening a thin rain falls, barely moistening the hard earth. In the scriptorium's candle glow, Brother Kieran opens the magnificent chronicle. His quill hovers above the page for the year. How to summarise this living nightmare? He dips in ink and writes in careful Latin script. Anno Domini 536, fame panis in Hibernia. The year 536 was marked by a shortage of bread. The words feel inadequate, mere scratchings to mark children dying in their mother's arms, an entire family is wandering in search of food that does not exist. And yet he must record it for posterity, as truthfully and simply as the annals of old. His hand shakes with exhaustion. Before blowing out the candle, Kieran adds a final thought in the margin. Sol pallidus supra nos est. The sun is pale above us. Outside, the rain stops. The night is deathly quiet. Brother Kieran steps out and looks upward. Where he should see a tapestry of stars, there is only a dull haze and the ruddy disk of a moon drained of its splendour. He thinks of the hungry faces he saw today. In the morning he will venture farther, maybe to the next valley, to see if they fared any better. Perhaps there will be news from beyond the seas that could explain this pall, or is it the wrath of God? He does not know. Pulling his thin cloak tighter, the monk whispers a hymn into the gloom. His Latin words tremble with both doubt and hope, drifting upward in a world that has seemingly lost the sun. In Constantinople, Eastern Roman Empire, 536. Stephanos steps out of the granary and into an eerie midday gloom. The Forum of Constantine should be bright at this hour, but the sun hangs weak in the sky, its light pale and without brightness. Under the colonnade, a brazier has ignited, providing flickering light where the sun cannot. Normally at noon, the great column's shadow would slice across the marble pavement. Today there is none. Stephanos pauses, bread ledger in hand, and suppresses a shiver. In his 30 years in Constantinople, he has never seen the sun like this. It's as if the day has been swallowed by an endless eclipse. He hurries through the forum, passing knots of anxious citizens. At the steps of the Hagia Sophia construction site, a knot of labourers kneel in prayer. Tools idle. Even the patriarch has ordered continual prayers, for fear that God's anger is upon the empire. Stephanos does not stop. As a junior official of the grain dole, his duty is to assess the city's bread supply. And the news is grim. The wheat shipments from Egypt have dwindled. The harvests up the Nile were poor this year. Fields yielded scant grain. Although the imperial granaries remain full, the customary surpluses have vanished. In the bread market, he sees long queues of gaunt faces. An elderly woman clutches her stomach, muttering that famine now rides alongside war like the black horseman of the apocalypse. Stephanos silently crosses himself at that, quickening his pace. Inside the Augustaion, a cluster of senators argues in low voices. Stephanos catches fragments as he passes. One laments that the blighted sun, which began during Consul Belisarius's year, is a dire omen. Another frets that if the produce is destroyed by this bad time, the legions will starve. Men are free neither from war nor pestilence nor any other thing leading to death, an elderly senator concludes. No one disagrees. At the docks on the Golden Horn, grain barges from Alexandria are being unloaded under the dim sun. The usual cacophony of stevedores is hushed. Everyone moves with the worried calm of men who know they carry precious food. Stephanos inspects the offloaded sacks. The wheat kernels are small, shrunken by poor yield. "Is this all?" he asks the harbour master. A shrug. "Afraid so. Even the bread basket of the world struggles now." Stephanos nods and makes a mark on his wax tablet. In the past, Egypt's bounty could feed Constantinople twice over. Now any shortage sends prices climbing. Already he has heard of riots in the poorer quarters at dawn when the meagre bread allotments ran out. He muses grimly about the concept of bread and circuses. Crossing back toward the palace, Stephanos peers up at the sky. The sun's hue is a strange bluish white, and the very air seems thick. A dry, foggy haze hangs high above, dulling the daylight. Some call it an omen, others say it's a natural miasma. One pamphlet circulating in the forum even claimed that a volcano in some far-off land must have vomited ash into the heavens, promptly confiscated by the urban prefect for spreading alarm. Stephanos does not know what to believe. He only knows that the empire lacks experience with simultaneous harvest failures across all regions. In the past, if Syria suffered drought, Egypt might compensate. But now Syria also reports withered crops and empty granaries. An empire that commands the Mediterranean cannot command the skies. That night, the city is preternaturally quiet. By decree, a candle-lit vigil is held in every church. Stephanos stands among a crowd in the great church's half-built nave. The air smells of wax and incense. By day, hundreds of tiny flames flicker where sunlight should stream in. The patriarch leads a solemn chant, beseeching God to restore the light and spare his people. Stephanos bows his head and joins the chorus. His mind wanders to his young daughter at home, who has known constant cough and hunger these past months. The sun gave forth light without brightness, like the moon. He remembers those words from a scholar's chronicle, and they ring true in his bones. He prays for the day he can show his child a bright, warm sun again. Until then, they endure in the half-light of an empire under siege by the very heavens. In the kingdom of Axum, Ethiopia 536, Miriam's sandals are worn thin by the time she and her little brother crest the last hill before Axum. Below them, the city's familiar landmarks rise from the plain, the tall stone stellae of bygone kings casting faint shadows in the ashen daylight, and beyond, the spires of the great stone church where her people have worshipped for generations. She urges her brother onward with a gentle hand. They have walked for 2 days from their village, driven by desperation. At home, the fields of teff and sorghum utterly failed. This year's rains never arrived, and the soil cracked beneath a brazen but feeble sun. Along the road they joined a trickle of other villagers and farmers, all converging toward Axum like streams to a dry riverbed. They strolled past the abandoned ox carcasses by the roadside and the deserted farms with nothing left to harvest. At the city gates, Miriam feels a surge of relief. They have arrived. But the sight before her quickly tempers that hope. Axum's marketplace, usually vibrant with traders from far lands, has been transformed into an open-air soup kitchen. Cook fires gutter under large cauldrons of porridge. Hundreds of people gather in lines, clutching bowls or baskets, their faces gaunt. The smell of thin millet gruel mingles with the acrid scent of despair. Miriam clutches her brother's hand and finds a spot at the end of a line. Overhead, the sky is a flat, dull white, the sun's disk barely visible. A local deacon moves down the line, intoning prayers in Ge'ez. He sprinkles holy water on the crowd from a palm frond. Normally, people save such blessings for festivals, but now they perform them to combat hopelessness. A small caravan arrives with a few camels laden with grain from the coast, but after a brief exchange with officials, most of it turns away. Even the major trade routes bring no food now. In Aksum's markets, one could once buy pepper from India, or wine from Nubia. Now even the humblest barley loaf is a treasure. As the line inches forward, Miriam passes by a group of nobles and priests gathered under an incense tree. She recognises Negus Caleb, King Caleb, among them by the gold-fringed cloth draped over his shoulders and the ornate processional cross he leans upon. Her ears catch an advisor reporting that the Nile's flood was weak, and even across the Red Sea no stores remain. The king's shoulders sag under his embroidered cloak. At last he raises his hands and calls out, "People of Aksum, God is testing us. We will open the last of the royal granaries to feed the hungry, share what you receive, and trust that the Lord will provide." A murmur of gratitude ripples through the throng. Miriam finally reaches the front. The deacon ladles a scoop of watery porridge into her clay bowl. It is not much, barely a few mouthfuls for each of them, but she murmurs, "Ames agin lahu, thank you," with a deep bow. Her brother swallows his portion greedily, licking the bowl. She forces herself to eat slowly, savouring each drop. Around her, others huddle on the ground in silence, some weeping with relief for this small mercy. At sunset, King Caleb leads a candle-lit procession through the streets. Miriam and her brother stand among the faithful lining the route. The king walks barefoot, carrying the gilded cross, followed by priests bearing icons. Their chants of Kyrie eleison, Lord have mercy, echo off the towering stellae. As the procession passes, Miriam closes her eyes and joins the singing. Never has she felt the community so united. Nobles and peasants, priests and paupers, all imploring heaven for deliverance. In the failing light, the king lifts the cross to bless the entire land. Miriam tightens her arm around her brother. Though hunger gnaws and the darkness endures, in that moment she takes solace in their collective hope. Under the mournful sky of 536, the people of Aksum face the long night together, their faith unbroken even as the world around them withers. Though hardship was far from over, a spark of hope persisted. Like dawn following the longest night, they trusted that better days would come again. In northern China, 536, the sky should have been a brilliant blue above the rice paddies, but today it is the colour of lead. Farmer Liang squints at the field where his family's livelihood lies. It is the 7th month of the year, high summer, yet a bitter wind rattles the stalks. Suddenly one of his sons cries out. Liang looks down in disbelief as snowflakes swirl onto the green rice shoots. Within minutes, a rare summer snowfall dusts the paddies, bending the young rice. The villagers stand helplessly by. Such a thing has never happened in living memory. Autumn brings no relief. The harvest is paltry and stunted, weeks late in ripening. By the 8th month, the famine is undeniable, the granaries are nearly empty. Liang's family begins mixing chaff and acorns into their rice to make it stretch. His youngest daughter stops growing. Her cheeks are sunken and grey. One afternoon, yellow powder drifts down from the sky, coating the village roofs in a film like ash. Villagers fear it is a curse from heaven. Whatever the cause, the crops are ruined, and hunger stalks the land. In the village temple, the headman burns incense before the altar of the earth god. The air is thick with smoke and the murmured prayers of desperate farmers. "We must appease heaven to now," the headman declares, sweat beading on his brow despite the cold. As night falls, the villagers carry an offering of their last millet and a slaughtered goat to the hill shrine. Liang watches as the small procession winds up the slope with lanterns bobbing. He holds his shivering daughter close. They set the offerings and bow until their foreheads touch the ground, begging for mercy, good weather, a decent harvest, anything. But the night sky offers no reply, only a faint glow where the moon hides behind a strange haze. The offering remains untouched by any deity. Weeks pass and starvation sets in. Liang feeds his children thin congee made from wild herbs and tree bark. His elderly mother quietly refuses her portion, pretending she has eaten so that the little ones might have more. Soon she grows too frail to leave her bed. One cold morning, Liang finds that her breathing has stopped. With shaking hands, he covers her body with a woven mat. There is no energy or grain to spare for proper funeral rites. Before her death, his mother had whispered that perhaps the emperor had lost heaven's mandate. How else to explain the son's betrayal? In grief, Liang wonders if the distant court's sins have brought on heaven's wrath. They hear of hungry folk in nearby provinces attacking granaries, but in Liang's village, though desperation grows, order holds for now. By early winter, bandits roam the countryside, stealing what little remains. One night, a gang of starving young men, once farmers from a nearby hamlet, break into Liang's storehouse, seizing the meagre sack of millet he had hidden. There are scuffles in the dark. His eldest son is struck with a staff while trying to defend their food. The thieves flee into the night, leaving the family bruised and without a single grain of food. When dawn breaks, Liang makes a decision. He gathers his family and tells them they can stay no longer. If they remain in the village, they will surely die. Rumours suggest that the harvests were better further south. Perhaps they could find food and employment there. That day, the family packs what little they have left. Liang hoists his weakened daughter onto his back. He takes one last look at the fields of their ancestors, now barren, dusted with frost. Together, the family joins a small band of neighbours on the road heading south, leaving behind their village to whatever fate the heavens had decreed. As they vanished into the white distance, their footprints were swiftly blanketed by the new snow, one family among countless others on the road that winter, all seeking a land where the sun still shone and grain could be found. It was the second year without a summer in Scandinavia, 536. In a seaside village of what would one day be called Sweden, Jarl Einar stood on the frozen shore at noon and saw no sun above, only a dim glow behind the grey sky. The world felt stuck in twilight. Fishermen had to chip through ice where the bay had frozen solid, hoping to catch a few starved cod. Inland, the fields lay under dirty snow even in what should have been the growing season. Einar's people had slaughtered most of their livestock last autumn. There was no fodder to keep them alive through another barren year. Half the benches in the hall were now empty. The strong had ventured south to gentler climates, and the frail had perished in the first famine winter. Inside the Jarl's longhouse, a small fire flickered weakly. Einar passed a hand over the embers and thought of the sun, once the great fire in the sky now vanished. His gut clenched with a mix of sorrow and dread. The village's priestess, Volva, had warned that they could be living through Fimbulvetur, the legendary great winter of Norse prophecy. 3 winters with no summer between, a prelude to Ragnarok, the end of the gods. Einar had scoffed at the time, but now he was not so sure. To placate the gods, they had tried everything. The previous fall, they sacrificed their finest ram and a pair of oxen to Freyr at harvest, yet the snows came early and stayed. In the spring, Einar himself cast a gold arm ring into the peat bog as an offering. Many nobles were said to be abandoning their treasures to the earth in hopes of buying back the sun. Still, the gods remained silent, and the sun's chariot did not return. By midwinter of that second sunless year, desperation hung like a fog. The village elders grimly agreed that only a human sacrifice might break the curse. That night, they offered up a captured thrall under the frost-covered ash tree, spilling his blood in Odin's name. But when dawn broke in yet another leaden sky, they knew even that was not enough. As spring of the 3rd year approached with little change, whispers began in the village. Some said that the Jarl's bloodline was cursed, that Odin and Freyr would accept nothing less than the life of the chieftain himself to set things right, just as in ancient tales a king had once been sacrificed to end a blight. Einar heard these murmurs and knew in his heart what had to be done. The next day he called an assembly at the sacred grove. Mustering his remaining strength, he addressed the tribe. "I will go to Odin's hall if it brings back the sun and the harvest," he declared. Gasps rippled through the crowd. His wife wailed, but he raised a hand gently. "We have all lost loved ones. If my life buys the dawn for those who remain, I give it freely." That evening, under the steel-grey sky, Jarl Einar knelt before the old oak tree in the grove. The Volva and 2 elders stood solemnly by with ceremonial knives. Einar's breath rose in white puffs. He felt no fear now, only a strange peace, as though he were already halfway to Valhalla. In a clear voice he chanted a final prayer, a plea for Thor to smash the dark clouds and for Freya to make the fields green once more. As the blade touched his skin, he closed his eyes and pictured golden summer sunlight. The knives did their work, and Einar slumped forward, life leaching into the frozen ground. A low moan of grief and hope rose from the villagers. After laying his body on a pyre with his cloak and shield, they ignited it, causing the flames to roar upwards. Throughout the long night they kept vigil, and then, in the early hours, a pale glow appeared in the eastern sky, stronger than any in months. As the sky lightened from black to murky blue, the villagers saw the outline of the sun, wan but emerging at last through a break in the haze. A murmur of awe swept over the crowd. They wept with joy, lifting their faces to feel its faint warmth. Whether it was Jarl Einar's noble sacrifice or simply the turning of fate, none could say, but the endless winter was finally loosening its grip. In the coming days, as the snows began to recede, the people raised a mound for their chieftain, honouring him as the saviour who gave himself so that spring could return. In the massive city of Chac Rouge, in modern El Salvador, or what we call Mesoamerica, in 536, the high priest Itzamnaj knelt before the temple's altar at midday. All around him, hundreds of people crowded the plaza in tense silence. For months the sun had hidden its face. A strange chill hung over the usually hot lands of the Maya. Crops of maize and cacao wilted in the unseasonal cool and dim light. The priests had consulted their calendars and made offerings of incense and jade, but nothing availed. Today they would entreat Kinich Ajor, the sun god, with the most precious offering of all, human blood. Itzamnaj rose to his feet and stretched his arms to the sky. On the altar stone before him lay a bound captive, painted blue for sacrifice. "O Lord of the sun, rise and eat, that you may shine upon us again," the priest cried out. A murmur of desperation rippled through the crowd. Using an obsidian blade, Itzamnaj swiftly opened the victim's chest. The crowd gasped as he raised the still-beating heart toward the heavens. "May this blood nourish you, O gods!" he shouted, his voice cracking. At that instant the ground shuddered violently. The ritual chant died on every tongue. Itzamnaj staggered, dropping the heart. A low rumble rolled through the earth. Suddenly the western horizon ignited with a pillar of fire. A volcano in the distance had exploded with unimaginable force. A massive plume of black ash rose, turning day into night in an instant. People screamed and scattered. Itzamnaj stood frozen atop the temple as he watched a wall of ash and rock hurtle toward the city, illuminated by eerie orange flames. The gods had answered, not with salvation, but with catastrophe. Within minutes, searing hot ash rained down upon Chac Rouge. Thatch roofs and wooden beams burst into flame. Men, women and children ran desperately for shelter, but there was none. Itzamnaj barely managed to scramble down the temple steps when a blast of furnace-hot wind knocked him flat. The air itself burned. He could not draw a breath without scorching his lungs. A torrent of pumice and ash buried temples and huts within hours. Those who did not die under falling debris succumbed to the suffocating soot and toxic gases. The proud city, its palaces, its ball courts, its altars, was being entombed in grey powder. Itzamnaj crawled, coughing, into the shelter of the temple courtyard wall. Through eyes stinging with ash, he beheld a scene from the darkest underworld. The sacred ceiba trees around the plaza were ablaze, and charred bodies lay strewn where moments ago the faithful had gathered. He clutched his obsidian dagger to his chest, numb with shock and guilt. Was this cataclysm the sun god's wrath for their offerings, or had the death of the sacrificial victim somehow unleashed a greater curse? His mind swam as the very ground continued to heave. Over the roar of the volcano, he thought he heard the distant, cruel laughter of the death gods. Hours later, a thick, unnatural darkness cloaked the land. The eruption's fury had finally ceased, leaving an eerie silence. Where the thriving city of Chac Rouge had stood was now a mouldering grey wasteland, buried under layers of ash. Itzamnaj, miraculously still alive, pulled himself from the ashen debris. The once clear river ran black with volcanic dust. He limped through the ruins, calling out the names of his wife and son, but heard no answer, only the faint crackle of cooling cinders. His sandals sank into the hot ash covering the plaza. The once grand temple lay in shattered ruins, half-buried corpses strewn everywhere. Overhead, the sky remained as dark as midnight, though it was long past noon. Itzamnaj stumbled to the edge of the city where the fields began. Nothing remained of the maize rows, only a ghostly landscape of ash dunes. The sun was completely veiled, and fine grey particles drifted through the air like deadly snow. The priest sank to his knees and raised trembling hands to the unseen sky. "Why?" he croaked, voice broken. There was no one left to hear his questions. In that moment, it seemed to Itzamnaj that the gods had abandoned the world entirely. He looked up at the churning darkness above, knowing that beyond this poisoned sky the sun still existed, but its light might not return for a long, long time. As the lone survivor began to wail amid the desolation, the suffocating ash cloud spread far beyond, ensuring that 536 would be remembered as a year of unparalleled darkness and sorrow, even in lands far from this doomed city. Across the world, as I have covered, the year 536 left a scar on the human story. In its wake, kingdoms faltered and populations were decimated. Chroniclers from Ireland to China recorded unusual cold summer snow, failed crops and famine. They wrote of a dry fog dimming the sun's light, of skies coloured with ash, and of hunger stalking the land. For 18 long months, much of the earth lay under a pall of gloom. In Europe and the Near East, people looked for divine meaning in the calamity. Christian writers wondered if Revelation's apocalyptic horsemen were unleashed. War, famine, pestilence, and death all seemed present at once. Indeed, the historian Procopius wrote that men were free neither from war nor pestilence nor any other thing leading to death during those dark days. The plague of Justinian, which followed the famine, soon checked Emperor Justinian's ambitions in the Eastern Roman Empire. In the British Isles, Celtic monks noted a failure of bread. Far to the east, Chinese records spoke of great cold and summer frost that ruined the harvest. Northern Europeans were so desperate they offered their riches and kings to appease their gods. And in Central America, a volcano's cataclysmic eruption blanketed the skies with ash, plunging entire regions into darkness. Societies across the globe, separated by vast oceans and unaware of each other, shared the same despair. The sun that year was a feeble ghost above the horizon, a shared anguish in Ireland's green hills, Constantinople's marble streets, Axum's highlands, China's villages, Scandinavia's forests, and Mesoamerica's jungles. Millions perished as famine and disease swept through communities already weakened by crop failure. It was, by all accounts, one of the darkest times in recorded history. Some later scholars would even call 536 the worst year to be alive. And yet not all hope died. In every story of suffering there were those who endured. Parents who shared their last crust with their kids, leaders who died for their people, and communities that prayed and performed rituals to find meaning in the chaos. They adapted in the face of collapse, migrating to new lands, changing their traditions and rebuilding from the ashes. The darkness would slowly lift. From 537 to 538, the sunlight grew stronger as the dust in the sky settled. Fields were sown anew. Children born after the year without sun would grow up under blue skies, hearing the hushed stories of the terrible darkness their elders survived. Looking back, the catastrophe of 536 stands as a testament to human endurance. It was a year of tragedy on a scale almost beyond comprehension, a convergence of natural disasters that humbled empires and small villages alike. But it was also a year that showed the resilience of the human spirit. In Ireland, monks kept the flame of learning alive through the long winter. In Byzantium, officials and neighbours shared what food they could to keep the starving alive. In Axum, faith and charity helped a kingdom pull through its worst famine. In Scandinavia, a people's devotion to their gods, however grim, kept their community united until the sun's return. Despite the loss of the Maya city in our story, other cities in Mesoamerica continued to exist, safeguarding knowledge and culture for future generations. Eventually the sun did return, brighter and warmer, as it always had before. The year 536 passed into history, its horrors softened by time, but those who lived through it would never forget how fragile their world could be. For a year it felt like night had fallen and the gods had abandoned humanity. Why wouldn't you last a day in 536? The people of that era faced unimaginable challenges, a sun that never shone, unfulfilled harvests, and a darkness that pushed the boundaries of hope. They persevered through faith, courage, and the fragile bonds of community, demonstrating that despite the most challenging year, humanity's determination to survive remained unwavering. In the end, dawn broke through the darkness, and life prevailed, scarred, changed, but ever hopeful beneath the return. Thomas Whitmore's lungs had forgotten what clean air tasted like. Each morning brought the same ritual, a violent coughing fit that painted crimson droplets across his wash basin, followed by the bitter knowledge that another day of breathing fire awaited him. The year was 1852, and Manchester's sky wore a permanent shroud of industrial smoke that transformed dawn into a sickly amber twilight. He dressed by candlelight in the cramped quarters above Morrison's Fire Brigade station, pulling on wool stockings that never quite dried, and boots whose leather had been scorched so many times they resembled charcoal more than hide. The primitive fire station housed 12 men in conditions that would shame a prison warden, but Thomas had learned not to complain. Complaints were about luxury items, and luxury belonged to the mill owners whose factories they risked their lives to protect. The bell's harsh clang shattered the pre-dawn silence, sending ice through Thomas's veins despite the cold warmed air. Another mill fire erupted. There was always another mill fire. The textile factories of industrial England burned with the regularity of sunrise, their wooden frames and cotton-stuffed interiors creating funeral pyres that could be seen from neighbouring counties. Thomas grabbed his leather helmet, cracked along the crown from falling timber, and joined the thunderous stampede down the station's narrow stairs. Outside, the grimy glory of Manchester was revealed. The streets gleamed with a perpetual slick of industrial waste, horse manure, and human filth that made every step treacherous. Gas lamps flickered weakly through the perpetual haze, casting ghostly circles of yellow light that barely penetrated the smoke-thick air. The city had grown too fast, its medieval street plan completely inadequate for the massive horse-drawn fire engines that now careened through its narrow arteries. Thomas hauled himself onto the side of the engine as it lurched into motion, the horse's hooves striking sparks from cobblestones worn smooth by endless industrial traffic. The leather fire hose coiled beside him like a sleeping serpent, its canvas skin stiff with accumulated soot and chemical residue. These hoses leaked profusely, often burst under pressure, and delivered water with all the force of a garden sprinkler, but they represented the cutting edge of firefighting technology, in an age when most blazes were fought with bucket brigades and prayer. The mill district loomed ahead, a landscape from Dante's imagination, where towering brick chimneys pierced the sky like accusatory fingers. Steam engines coughed and wheezed behind the rhythmic pounding vibrated through the grimy windows, creating a constant industrial heartbeat. Between the factories, ramshackle tenements housed the workers in conditions that would make medieval peasants weep. Entire families crowded into single rooms, sharing their space with rats, disease, and the ever-present threat of fire. As they rounded the corner onto Bridgewater Street, Thomas saw their destination. Pemberton's cotton mill, its upper floors already crowned with flames that danced against the smoke-dark sky like a demonic ballet. The fire had started in the picking room. They always started in the picking room, where cotton fibres floated through the air like combustible snow, waiting for a single spark from the gas lighting, or an overheated steam pipe to transform the workspace into an inferno. Workers streamed from the building in panic, their faces blackened with soot, many clutching burned hands or nursing singed hair. Among them stumbled children, some barely 10 years old, who had been operating the spinning machinery when the fire erupted. The sight of these young faces, aged beyond their years by industrial labour, and now marked by terror, reminded Thomas why he had chosen this profession, despite its countless horrors. The mill owner, Mr. Pemberton himself, stood across the street in his fine wool coat and polished boots, calculating his losses with the same dispassionate precision he used to calculate his profits. Insurance would cover the building, but not the disruption to production. Tomorrow, he would simply relocate his operations to another mill and resume grinding human lives into cotton thread and shareholder dividends. Thomas checked his equipment one final time. A crude leather speaking trumpet for coordinating with his fellow firefighters, a hand axe for breaking down doors and clearing debris, and a length of rope that served as both lifeline and last resort. No breathing apparatus existed. Firefighters simply held their breath or breathed through wet cloth when the smoke became unbearable. The firefighters wore no protective clothing apart from their thick wool coats and leather helmets. They lacked radio communication, hydraulic ladders, and foam suppressants. There were only 12 men equipped with hand-pumped engines who were determined to stop the fire from engulfing the entire district. The heat hit Thomas like a physical blow as they approached the burning mill, the flames creating their own weather system of updrafts and downdrafts that sent burning debris spiralling through the air like deadly confetti. The temperature difference between the fire and the frigid Manchester air created sudden wind shears that could knock a man off his feet or redirect flames in unexpected directions. The Pemberton Mill fire revealed its true character as Thomas and his crew established their position. What appeared from a distance to be a manageable blaze transformed into a multi-headed monster that defied every principle of 19th century firefighting. The flames had found the mill's ventilation system, utilising the carefully designed airflow that prevented workers from suffocating on cotton dust and allowed the fire to spread throughout the building with terrifying efficiency. Thomas's crew chief, Captain Morrison, shouted orders through the chaos, his voice barely audible above the roar of flames and the screaming of steam engines. With 20 years of firefighting experience under his belt, the captain's face was marked with scars from flying sparks, and his left hand was missing 2 fingers due to a rope burn that had gone septic. In an era before workers' compensation or medical benefits, Morrison's wound served as both a badge of honour and a painful reminder of the profession's costs. The hand-pumped engines positioned themselves along the street, their crews settling into a brutal rhythm that would persist until the fire was extinguished or the men succumbed to exhaustion. 2 men operated each pump handle, working in shifts of 30 seconds before switching off, while a third man aimed the leather hose and prayed it wouldn't burst from the modest pressure that they could generate. The pumps delivered perhaps 50 gallons per minute at their peak, a pathetic trickle compared to modern standards, but revolutionary technology in 1852. Thomas found himself assigned to search and rescue, the deadliest job in a profession where death was a frequent visitor. Mill fires were particularly treacherous because the building's wooden floors and supports could collapse without warning, transformed by heat into elaborate death traps. The textile machinery itself became another hazard. Massive spinning wheels and looms turned into twisted metal sculptures that could impale or crush anyone unfortunate enough to encounter them in the smoke-filled darkness. He wrapped a wet cloth around his face and plunged into the mill's ground floor where the air hung thick enough to cut with a knife. The temperature climbed steadily as he ascended the building's rickety stairs, each step taking him deeper into an environment hostile to human life. Gas lamps had exploded throughout the building, their broken fixtures creating additional fire sources while leaving the interior in near-total darkness. The mill's layout followed the industrial efficiency principles that maximise production while minimising worker comfort or safety. Narrow aisles between massive machines left little room for evacuation, while the building's few exits concentrated workers into bottlenecks during emergencies. Windows were small and high, designed to prevent workers from being distracted by the outside world rather than to facilitate escape. Thomas navigated by feel and instinct, calling out for survivors while trying to maintain his sense of direction in the maze-like interior. On the second floor he found her, Mary O'Brien, a spinner whose skirts had caught fire from a fallen gas fixture. She lay unconscious beneath an overturned loom, her breathing shallow and laboured. The flames had spread to her hair before she managed to smother them, leaving patches of scalp visible through the burned strands. Thomas lifted her carefully, knowing that burns covered much of her body beneath the charred fabric of her work dress. The journey back to the stairs became a nightmare of disorientation and mounting heat. The fire had spread across the ceiling above them, creating a canopy of flame that dropped burning debris like rain. Thomas's wool coat began to solder, the heavy fabric protecting his skin while slowly cooking him from the outside in. His leather helmet grew hot enough to brand flesh, but removing it would expose his head to the falling embers that filled the air. Halfway down the stairs, the building shuddered. Thomas felt the floor beneath his feet sag ominously as the fire consumed the structural supports. Somewhere above them, a steam engine's boiler exploded, creating a tremor throughout the building that cracked walls and shattered the few remaining windows. The mill was dying, its industrial skeleton collapsing under the assault of flames and superheated air. Thomas emerged from the building just as the roof began its final collapse. Mary O'Brien's unconscious form draped across his shoulders. His fellow firefighters rushed to help, but their faces told him what he already knew: she would likely die from her injuries. Burns covering more than 30% of the body were almost invariably fatal in an era before antibiotics, IV fluids, or skin grafts. The best they could offer was laudanum for the pain and perhaps a priest for the end. Behind them, the Pemberton mill continued its spectacular destruction. The fire had found the building's main steam engine, a massive beast that powered the entire facility's machinery. As the flames heated its boiler beyond safe limits, the engine began to scream, literally scream, as steam escaped through safety valves that had never been designed for such extreme conditions. The sound pierced the air like the death cry of some industrial dragon, audible for miles across Manchester's smoke-shrouded landscape. Thomas set Mary O'Brien gently on a stretcher improvised from mill workers' coats, then turned back toward the building. Captain Morrison grabbed his arm, shaking his head grimly. "She's gone, lad! The whole upper floor's coming down." But Thomas had heard something else. A child's cry from the building's far end, where the mill's newest workers operated the smallest spinning machines. 10-year-old fingers were perfect for threading the delicate machinery, and mill owners had learned to exploit this anatomical advantage with ruthless efficiency. Now those same small hands were trapped somewhere in the collapsing structure, and every second of delay meant another young life would be consumed by industrial progress. The mill's east wing housed what the workers grimly called the children's floor, a cramped, poorly ventilated space where boys and girls as young as 8 operated the piecing machines that connected broken cotton threads. Their small stature allowed them to crawl beneath the spinning machinery to collect waste cotton, while their nimble fingers could perform repairs that would take adult workers twice as long. Mill owners justified this exploitation as industrial training, preparing the next generation for lives of productive labour, while conveniently ignoring the stunted growth, respiratory diseases, and frequent accidents that marked these young workers like brands. Thomas could hear them before he saw them, high-pitched cries of terror echoing from the building's southeast corner, where the children's workstation occupied a space barely larger than a residential parlour. The fire had not yet reached this section, but smoke was pouring through the floorboards from the conflagration below, creating a toxic fog that would kill as efficiently as flames. These children had nowhere to run. The mill's design trapped them behind rows of machinery, accessible only through narrow passages that adult rescuers could barely navigate. He dropped to his hands and knees, crawling beneath the spinning frames toward the sound of crying. The air near the floor was slightly cleaner, but it was still thick enough to burn his throat with every breath. His leather helmet scraped against the machinery above him, dislodging years of accumulated cotton dust that fell like industrial snow. This dust, he knew, would ignite at the slightest spark, transforming the confined space into a powder keg. The first child he found was Billy Henderson, 11 years old and barely 4 feet tall, his growth stunted by years of malnutrition and industrial labour. Billy operated a scavenging machine that collected waste cotton from beneath the spinning frames, a job that required him to spend 10 hours daily in a space designed for someone half his size. Now he crouched, frozen with terror, his work clothes soaked with the machine oil that could ignite at any moment. "Come on, lad," Thomas whispered, extending his hand through the maze of mechanical components. "We're going out together, you and me." Billy's eyes were wide with shock, but he managed to grasp Thomas's outstretched fingers. The boy weighed perhaps 60 pounds, his body wasted by the combination of factory work and poverty that characterised a working-class childhood in industrial England. Behind Billy, Thomas could see other small forms huddled in the smoke, perhaps half a dozen children trapped by the collapsing mill's deadly geometry. The machinery that had employed them now imprisoned them, its iron arms and wooden frames creating a lattice of obstacles between the children and any possible escape route. Moving them one by one would take too long. The floor beneath them was already beginning to sag as the fire consumed the building's structural supports. Thomas made a decision that violated every principle of safe rescue work. Instead of retreating with Billy, he pushed deeper into the machinery maze, gathering children like a shepherd collecting his flock. Sarah Mitchell, 9 years old, her hands permanently stained with machine dyes. Peter Shaw, 10, who had lost the tip of his index finger to a spinning wheel the previous month. Jenny Coleman, barely 8, who earned 6pence a day threading bobbins for her family's survival. The heat was becoming unbearable, the smoke so thick that Thomas could barely see his hands. His wool coat had begun to smoulder in earnest, filling the air with the acrid smell of burning wool. The children clung to him with desperate strength, their small faces blackened with soot and streaked with tears. He could feel their terror through their trembling bodies, these young victims of industrial progress who had never known childhood as anything but labour. "Hold on to each other," he commanded, his voice hoarse from smoke inhalation. "We're going out together, all of us." He formed them into a human chain, the oldest children supporting the youngest, while he led them through the maze of machinery toward what he hoped was still a navigable exit. The building groaned around them, its death throes accompanied by the sound of splintering wood and collapsing masonry. The stairs had become a furnace. Thomas could see flames licking up through the gaps between steps, while the banister glowed red-hot from the heat below. The children behind him began to whimper as the temperature climbed beyond endurance, but retreat was no longer possible. The mill's upper floors were collapsing section by section, creating a domino effect that would soon reach their position. Thomas wrapped his coat around as many children as possible, using his body as a shield against the radiant heat that filled the stairwell. His exposed skin began to blister, the leather of his helmet so hot it burned his scalp through his hair. Step by step they descended through an environment that seemed more like biblical hell than an English textile mill. Jenny Coleman stumbled, her small legs finally giving way to exhaustion and terror. Thomas swept her up without breaking stride, her tiny body weighing almost nothing against his smoke-filled chest. Behind them, the children's workroom erupted in flames, as the fire finally found the accumulated cotton dust and machine oil. The explosion sent a pillar of flame shooting up through the building's core, illuminating their escape route with hellish brilliance. They emerged from the building just as the mill's main chimney began to crack. The massive brick structure, weakened by the intense heat and thermal expansion, developed a visible fissure that ran from its base to its crown. Thomas hurried the children away from the building as chunks of masonry began to rain down around them, each impact sending tremors through the already unstable street. Captain Morrison met them with a mixture of relief and amazement. "6 of them," he said, counting the soot-covered children who clustered around Thomas like chicks around a hen. "How in God's name did you get 6 of them out?" Thomas didn't answer immediately. He was too busy checking each child for injuries, his trained eye cataloguing burns, cuts, and the signs of smoke inhalation that could prove fatal in the hours to come. As they watched from across the street, the mill began to collapse in earnest. 5 stories of industrial architecture pancaked into rubble, sending up a cloud of dust and debris that obscured the surrounding buildings. The sound was indescribable, not just the crash of falling masonry, but the death scream of an entire industrial ecosystem. Steam engines, textile machinery, raw cotton, and human dreams were all compressed into a smoking pile of debris that would continue to burn for 3 more days. Manchester's atmosphere had been transformed by industrial progress into something barely recognisable as air. The city's hundreds of mill chimneys released a constant stream of coal smoke, chemical vapours, and cotton dust that created a permanent atmospheric soup thick enough to taste. For firefighters, this toxic environment posed a daily challenge to their respiratory systems, threatening their lives decades before the onset of old age. Thomas stood outside the collapsed Pemberton Mill, drawing what Parhot passed for fresh air into lungs that felt lined with sandpaper. Each breath brought a cocktail of sulfur dioxide from coal combustion, chlorine gas from textile bleaching operations, and microscopic particles of cotton, wool, and coal dust that would embed themselves permanently in his lung tissue. The children he had rescued coughed beside him, their small lungs struggling to process air that contained more industrial waste than oxygen. The fire brigade's primitive medical knowledge offered no protection against these airborne toxins. Firefighters occasionally held wet cloths over their faces during particularly smoky fires, but their methods provided minimal filtration against the complex chemical mixture that constituted Manchester's atmosphere. No one understood the long-term health consequences of chronic exposure to industrial pollutants, though the city's mortality statistics told a grim story that civic leaders preferred to ignore. Dr. Henry Ashworth, one of Manchester's few physicians willing to treat working-class patients, arrived at the fire scene to examine the rescued mill workers. His presence was unusual. Most doctors refused to venture into the industrial districts, claiming their practices required them to focus on patients who could afford their fees. Ashworth was different, a Quaker whose religious beliefs compelled him to treat all patients regardless of their ability to pay. "Bring the children here," Ashworth called to Thomas, setting up a makeshift examination area using crates from a nearby warehouse. His medical bag contained the era's limited arsenal against burns and smoke inhalation, laudanum for pain, sal volatile for fainting, and clean bandages that would be as precious as gold in the days to come. He began with Jenny Coleman, the youngest victim, whose small body showed the telltale signs of severe smoke inhalation. Her breathing is compromised, the doctor told Thomas quietly, using medical terminology to spare the child additional fear. The superheated air has damaged her throat and lungs, without proper treatment. He left the sentence unfinished, but Thomas understood. Jenny would likely die within days, her small body unable to recover from injuries that would challenge a healthy adult. The other children fared slightly better, but all exhibited signs of respiratory damage that would affect them for the rest of their lives. Peter Shaw's hands were severely burned from grabbing hot machinery during his escape, while Sarah Mitchell had inhaled enough toxic smoke to leave her with a chronic cough that would never fully heal. These children, if they survived, would join Manchester's growing population of industrial invalids, workers whose bodies had been broken by the machinery of progress. Dr. Ashworth moved among the adult mill workers with growing alarm. The fire had released chemicals from the textile manufacturing process that created a toxic atmosphere even more dangerous than usual. Bleaching agents had mixed with cotton dust and coal smoke to produce compounds that attacked the respiratory system with particular viciousness. Several workers showed signs of chemical pneumonia, their lungs filling with fluid as their bodies tried to protect themselves from the poisonous air. "This is worse than anything I've seen," Ashworth confided to Thomas as they watched the mill's ruins continue to smoulder. "The fire has created chemical compounds that don't exist in nature. We're watching the birth of an industrial disease, and we have no idea how to treat it." His words proved prophetic. Within a generation, Manchester would become synonymous with respiratory illness, its residents suffering from conditions that doctors struggled to understand, much less cure. Thomas felt the toxins working on his body as he helped organise the rescue efforts. His throat burned with each breath while his eyes streamed continuously from the chemical irritation. His chest felt tight, as though invisible bands were constricting his lungs, making each inhalation a conscious effort. Around him, his fellow firefighters showed similar symptoms, their faces flushed and their breathing laboured, despite their years of experience with smoke-filled environments. The city's response to the toxic air crisis revealed the industrial age's priorities with brutal clarity. Mill owners demanded that their workers return to the neighbouring factories immediately, claiming that production delays would harm Manchester's economic competitiveness. Local authorities focused on clearing the rubble to restore traffic flow, showing little concern for the health consequences of disturbing the contaminated debris. Only Dr. Ashworth and a handful of religious leaders seemed to recognise the human catastrophe unfolding in the smoke-filled streets. Captain Morrison gathered his men for the journey back to the fire station, his face grim with the knowledge that their work was far from over. The industrial district of Manchester housed dozens of mills similar to Pemberton's, each posing a potential hazard due to their combustible materials and insufficient safety precautions. The fire they had just fought would be followed by others, an endless cycle of destruction and rescue that consumed firefighters' lives as efficiently as it consumed buildings. As they loaded their equipment onto the horse-drawn engines, Thomas noticed that several of his colleagues were coughing up blood, a sure sign that the toxic smoke had damaged their lungs beyond the body's ability to repair. These men would continue working because they had no choice. Firefighters who couldn't perform their duties simply starved, as no disability benefits or medical pensions existed for public servants injured in the line of duty. The journey back through Manchester's streets revealed the industrial apocalypse in its full horror. The permanent haze that hung over the city had thickened from the mill fire, reducing visibility to a few yards and turning the afternoon into perpetual twilight. Gas lamps burned continuously, their flames struggling to penetrate the toxic fog that enveloped the city like a burial shroud. The Morrison Fire Brigade station stood as a monument to society's half-hearted commitment to public safety, its cramped quarters and primitive equipment reflecting the industrial era's priorities with depressing accuracy. Built in 1845 as Manchester's textile wealth reached its peak, the station housed state-of-the-art firefighting technology that would have been considered inadequate 50 years earlier. The building's designer had clearly never witnessed an actual fire, creating a facility that prioritised architectural appearance over practical function. Thomas climbed wearily from the fire engine, his body aching from the physical demands of rescue work and the toxic assault of Manchester's poisoned air. The station's equipment bay revealed the pathetic arsenal available to firefighters in the industrial age. Leather hoses that leaked more water than they delivered, hand-pumped engines that required 8 men to operate effectively, and wooden ladders whose rungs had been charred and weakened by repeated exposure to flames. The fire engine itself represented the pinnacle of 1852 technology, a steam-powered pump mounted on a horse-drawn chassis that could, under ideal conditions, deliver water at pressures approaching those of a modern garden hose. The boiler required 20 minutes to build steam from a cold start, assuming someone had remembered to keep it supplied with coal and water. During fires, this delay often meant the difference between saving a building and watching it collapse into rubble. Captain Morrison initiated the post-fire equipment inspection with a weary resignation reminiscent of a man who had carried out this ritual countless times. The leather hoses showed new splits and tears from the superheated environment, their canvas reinforcement charred beyond reliable use. The brass nozzles had warped from exposure to extreme temperatures, creating irregular spray patterns that reduced their effectiveness even further. Most of the hand tools, axes, pry bars and rope showed signs of heat damage that would make them unreliable in future emergencies. Henderson, Morrison called to the station's senior firefighter, a grizzled veteran whose left arm hung useless from an injury sustained during the Great Warehouse Fire of 1849. Take inventory of the hose sections. Please identify the sections that require patching and those that need complete replacement. Henderson nodded grimly, knowing that replacing entirely meant submitting requests to the City Council that would be debated for months, while fires continued to consume Manchester's industrial districts. The station's primitive communication system consisted of a single bell that could be heard perhaps 6 blocks away on a quiet day, but was often lost in the industrial cacophony that filled Manchester's streets. Fire reporting relied on runners or mounted messengers who often arrived at the station long after flames had established themselves beyond any hope of control. Thomas had responded to fires that had been burning for hours before anyone thought to summon professional firefighters, arriving to find only smouldering ruins and charred corpses. A corner of the equipment bay held medical supplies, a testament to society's high expectations for firefighter survival. A few rolls of bandages, a bottle of laudanum, and some sal volatile represented the brigade's entire medical arsenal. No provisions existed for treating burns, smoke inhalation, or the countless injuries that firefighters sustained during rescue operations. Fires simply claimed the lives of men seriously injured, adding their bodies to the growing casualty list of the Industrial Revolution. The sleeping quarters above the equipment bay housed 12 men in conditions that would shame a medieval monastery. Narrow cots arranged in military formation left barely enough room to walk between them, while a single window provided the only ventilation for the entire space. During summer months, the combination of body heat and smoke-saturated clothing created an atmosphere that rivaled the fires they fought for sheer unpleasantness. Thomas meticulously inspected his personal equipment as if his life relied on its dependability. His leather helmet bore new scorch marks from the mill fire, the protective coating blistered and peeling from exposure to extreme heat. The speaking trumpet he used to coordinate rescue efforts had developed a crack along its length that would reduce its effectiveness in noisy environments. His rope showed signs of heat damage that could cause it to fail under stress, leaving him stranded in a burning building. The brigade's horses occupied stalls adjacent to the main building, their care consuming a significant portion of the department's modest budget. These animals were essential to firefighting operations, but they required constant maintenance and were vulnerable to the same toxic atmosphere that plagued human residents. Several horses had died from respiratory ailments caused by chronic exposure to industrial smoke, their replacement representing a financial burden that stretched the brigade's resources beyond their limits. Water supply presented another insurmountable challenge in Manchester's industrial environment. The city's water mains, designed for domestic use rather than firefighting, could not provide adequate pressure or volume for serious blazes. Firefighters often found themselves competing with industrial users for access to water, while mill owners who controlled private water sources frequently refused to make them available during emergencies. The economic realities of firefighting in industrial England created a system where property owners' ability to pay determined the level of protection they received. Wealthy mill owners could purchase private fire insurance that included dedicated firefighting services, while working-class neighbourhoods relied on municipal brigades that were chronically underfunded and understaffed. Thomas had witnessed the destruction of buildings as firefighters, lacking the necessary equipment or authority to intervene in fires affecting uninsured properties, stood helplessly nearby. Captain Morrison called the brigade together for their daily briefing, his weathered face showing the cumulative effects of decades spent breathing smoke and toxic fumes. The Pemberton Mill fire consumed 6 lives, he announced, his voice heavy with the weight of repeated tragedy. 3 children and 3 adults died from smoke inhalation, while 14 others remain in the hospital with injuries that may prove fatal. The mill itself is a total loss, representing £40,000 in damage to the building and machinery. The human cost of the fire would extend far beyond the immediate casualties. Families who had lost their primary wage earners would face destitution in an era before social safety nets or workers' compensation. Children orphaned by industrial accidents became burdens on an overwhelmed charity system that could provide only the most basic subsistence. The mill workers who survived would face unemployment until new facilities could be constructed, assuming they could find employers willing to hire workers with visible burn scars or respiratory damage. Manchester's industrial districts never truly slept, their machinery clattering through the night hours while skeleton crews maintained production schedules that recognised no distinction between day and darkness. For firefighters, this meant that emergencies could strike at any hour, pulling exhausted men from their meagre rest to face blazes that seemed even more terrifying when illuminated only by their flames and the feeble glow of gas street lamps. Thomas had been asleep for perhaps 2 hours when the alarm bell shattered the station's relative quiet, its urgent clanging echoing off the brick walls of the sleeping quarters. Around him, 11 other men rolled from their cots with the practiced efficiency of soldiers responding to battle stations, pulling on boots and coats that never had time to fully dry between calls. The station's single oil lamp cast dancing shadows that transformed familiar equipment into menacing shapes, while outside the building, Manchester's perpetual industrial fog muffled all sound except the insistent demand of the alarm. Captain Morrison appeared in the doorway, his face grim in the lamplight. "Whitworth Mill on Deansgate," he announced tersely. "Multiple floors are involved, and there are reports of workers trapped inside." The men needed no further explanation. Whitworth Mill represented one of Manchester's largest textile operations, a 6-storey monument to industrial efficiency that employed nearly 300 workers across its various departments. A fire in such a facility could easily become a catastrophe that would dwarf the previous day's Pemberton Mill disaster. The night journey through Manchester's streets revealed the industrial city's nocturnal character, a landscape of glowing furnaces and smoking chimneys that painted the fog with hellish colours. Gas lamps flickered weakly through the permanent haze, their light barely penetrating the toxic atmosphere that filled the narrow streets. The horse-drawn fire engine clattered over cobblestones slick with industrial waste and condensed chemical vapours, its iron wheels striking sparks that briefly illuminated the grim faces of night shift workers heading home from 12-hour shifts in the mills. Whitworth Mill announced itself from several blocks away, its upper floors crowned with flames that rose higher than the surrounding buildings and cast an orange glow that penetrated even Manchester's industrial fog. Before anyone thought to summon the brigade, the fire had been burning for some time, spreading throughout the building's upper levels, while workers on the lower floors continued their tasks, blissfully unaware of the disaster unfolding above them. Thomas immediately realised that this fire would challenge the limits of their outdated equipment and methods. The building's height made it impossible to reach the upper floors with their ladders, while the intensity of the flames suggested that the fire had found the mill's stored cotton and was feeding on thousands of pounds of combustible material. Workers streamed from the building's ground floor exits, many carrying their few possessions, while others supported injured colleagues whose burns would likely prove fatal. The mill's night supervisor, a thin man whose permanently stained clothes testified to years spent among the textile machinery, approached Captain Morrison with visible panic. "There are a dozen workers on the 5th floor," he reported, his voice cracking with stress. "The main staircase collapsed 20 minutes ago, and we can't reach them through the smoke." Morrison nodded grimly, knowing that a dozen workers trapped on the 5th floor of a burning building represented a death sentence that 1852 technology could not commute. Thomas found himself assigned to interior reconnaissance, a polite term for entering a burning building to determine how many people would die before the night ended. He wrapped a wet cloth around his face and plunged into the mill's ground floor, where the air hung thick with smoke and the temperature climbed steadily as he moved deeper into the building. The textile machinery created a maze of obstacles that seemed designed to trap anyone attempting to navigate in near-zero visibility. The layout of the building, designed to maximise productive space while minimising everything else, resulted in narrow aisles, low ceilings and bottleneck exits that became deadly traps during emergencies. Gas lighting fixtures had exploded throughout the facility, their shattered remains creating additional fire sources while leaving the interior in dangerous darkness. Thomas navigated the smoke-filled maze by feeling and instinct, calling out for survivors. On the second floor he encountered the mill's steam engine, a massive mechanical heart that continued to pound rhythmically, even as flames consumed the building around it. The engine's automatic stoking system fed coal into its firebox without regard for the surrounding emergency, maintaining steam pressure that powered machinery on floors where no workers remained to operate it. The combination of superheated steam and surrounding flames created an environment so hostile to human life that Thomas could barely approach within 20 feet of the engine room. The staircase to the upper floors had indeed collapsed, its wooden construction no match for the intense heat generated by tons of burning cotton. Through the gap where the stairs once stood, Thomas could hear the voices of the trapped workers on the 5th floor, their cries becoming weaker due to the effects of smoke inhalation. He attempted to throw them a rope, but the distance was too great and the angle too steep for any practical rescue attempt. Outside the building, the fire's spectacular growth had attracted a crowd of spectators who gathered at what they considered a safe distance to watch the industrial catastrophe unfold. Mill fires provided free entertainment for Manchester's working class, a dramatic break from the monotonous routine of factory labour. These observers showed little concern for the human tragedy playing out inside the burning building, their attention focused instead on the impressive display of flames and the building's eventual collapse. Here, Dr. Ashworth arrived at the scene despite the late hour, his medical bag and portable surgical kit marking him as one of the few professionals willing to treat industrial accident victims. He began triaging the workers who had escaped the building, quickly identifying those whose injuries required immediate attention and those who were beyond medical help. The night air filled with the moans of burn victims and the sobbing of workers who had watched colleagues disappear into the flames. Thomas emerged from the building as its internal structure began to fail, the massive timbers that supported its 6 floors finally succumbing to the intense heat and the weight of collapsing masonry. The trapped workers on the 5th floor fell silent, their voices lost in the thunderous crash of falling machinery and structural beams. He had failed to save them, another dozen names to add to the growing list of industrial casualties that haunted his dreams. Dawn broke over Manchester like a revelation of hell. The rising sun filtered through layers of industrial smoke and chemical fog until it resembled a sickly orange eye surveying the destruction below. The Whitworth Mill had burned through the night, its 6 stories collapsing section by section until nothing remained but a smoking pile of rubble that would continue to smoulder for days. Thomas stood among the debris, his face blackened with soot and his lungs raw from breathing the toxic air that passed for atmosphere in England's industrial heartland. 12 workers had died in the Whitworth fire, their bodies crushed beneath falling machinery or consumed by flames that reached temperatures exceeding anything natural. Their names would be recorded in the city's death registers as industrial accidents, statistical abstractions that failed to capture the human cost of Manchester's textile prosperity. Behind each name stood a family thrust into destitution, children left orphaned in a society that viewed their survival as a private matter rather than a public responsibility. The mill owner, Mr. Whitworth himself, surveyed the ruins from his carriage, calculating insurance settlements and replacement costs with the same methodical precision he applied to production quotas. The building had been insured for its full value, while the machinery could be replaced within months if orders were placed immediately with the foundries of Sheffield and Birmingham. The human losses barely registered in his accounting. Workers were abundant and easily replaced, their families suffering invisible to men who measured success in pounds sterling and production efficiency. Thomas walked among the survivors, offering what comfort he could to people whose worlds had been destroyed in a single night. Mrs. Hartwell clutched the burned remains of her husband's work clothes, the fabric still warm from the flames that had claimed his life. Her 3 children huddled around her skirts, their faces already showing the hollow expression of poverty that would mark them for the remainder of their shortened lives. Industrial England provided no compensation for workplace deaths, no pensions for widows, and no support for orphaned children whose crime was being born into the working class. Dr. Ashworth moved among the injured with growing despair, his medical knowledge inadequate against the scale of suffering that surrounded him. Burns covering more than 20% of the body were invariably fatal in an era before fluid replacement therapy or antibiotic treatment. He could offer laudanum for pain and perhaps preserve life for a few additional days, but the fundamental reality remained unchanged. Industrial progress consumed human lives as fuel for its advancement, and society accepted this sacrifice as the natural order of things. The city's response to the fire revealed the true priorities of industrial civilization with brutal clarity. Within hours of the building's collapse, municipal authorities had dispatched crews to clear the rubble and restore traffic flow through the district. The dead would be buried quickly and quietly, their families' grief subordinated to the economic imperative of maintaining industrial production. New workers would be recruited from the countryside, drawn by promises of steady wages that failed to mention the probability of industrial accident or early death from respiratory disease. Captain Morrison gathered his exhausted firefighters for the journey back to their station, his weathered face showing the cumulative toll of decades spent fighting fires with inadequate equipment and insufficient support. 3 of his men showed signs of serious injury from the night's work. Henderson had suffered severe burns on his hands and arms, while Collins coughed blood that indicated potentially fatal lung damage. These men would continue working because they had no alternative. Firefighters who could not perform their duties simply disappeared into Manchester's growing population of industrial invalids. The economic mathematics of firefighting in 1852 Manchester demonstrated society's perverted priorities with mathematical precision. The city allocated more money to street cleaning than to fire prevention, and more resources to maintaining public gardens than to protecting working-class neighbourhoods from industrial blazes. Fire insurance companies employed private brigades to protect wealthy districts while public firefighters struggled with primitive equipment and skeleton crews. The message was clear: property mattered more than people, profit more than human life. Thomas reflected on his chosen profession as the fire engine clattered through Manchester's smoke-filled streets. He had become a firefighter, believing he could save lives and protect his community from the ravages of industrial progress. Instead, he found himself serving as witness to a systematic destruction of human life that masqueraded as economic advancement. Every fire revealed the same pattern: preventable accidents caused by cost-cutting measures, inadequate safety equipment, and building designs that prioritized production efficiency over worker survival. The Industrial Revolution had transformed firefighting from a community responsibility into a professional necessity, but society had failed to provide the resources necessary for success. Firefighters operated with equipment that belonged in the previous century, received training that consisted mainly of learning from the mistakes of dead colleagues, and worked for wages that barely sustained life in the expensive industrial cities. Men who viewed worker safety as an unnecessary expense that reduced shareholder profits expected firefighters to risk their lives to protect their investments. As they approached the fire station, Thomas could see the next generation of Manchester's industrial workforce streaming toward the mills for the morning shift. Children as young as 8 walked alongside their parents, heading for jobs that would consume their childhoods and probably end their lives before they reached 40. These young faces reminded him why he continued fighting fires despite the profession's countless horrors. Someone had to stand between Manchester's working population and the industrial forces that treated human beings as disposable components in a vast economic machine. Before they had finished unloading their equipment, the station bell rang again, its urgent clanging announcing another fire, in another mill, another group of workers whose lives were in the balance. Thomas checked his scorched equipment one more time, pulled on his battered leather helmet, and prepared to enter hell once again. This was the reality of being an Industrial Revolution firefighter, an endless cycle of tragedy and loss, fought with primitive weapons against an enemy that grew stronger with each passing day. Manchester's smoke-stained sky offered no promise of better days ahead, only the certainty that more fires would follow, more lives would be lost, and more families would be thrust into poverty by the inexorable demands of industrial progress. Thomas climbed aboard the fire engine as it lurched into motion, carrying him toward another confrontation with the forces that were reshaping England into something barely recognisable as human civilization. The towering chimneys of the mill districts, stretching endlessly in all directions, released clouds of toxic smoke, turning the very air into poison. This was the world that Industrial Revolution firefighters inhabited. A landscape where human life was measured in production units, where worker safety was subordinated to profit margins, and where the brave men who risked everything to save others were themselves considered expendable components in the great industrial machine. As the fire engine vanished into the ever-present haze of Manchester, Thomas grasped the profound frustration of being an Industrial Revolution firefighter. They were fighting a war they could never win, using weapons that guaranteed their destruction, in service of a society that viewed their sacrifice as both necessary and invisible. The flames they battled were merely symptoms of a larger conflagration that was consuming the soul of industrial England, leaving behind a wasteland where human dignity had been traded for economic efficiency and where the price of progress was measured in unmarked graves. As a dominant power in East Asia. Through rapid industrialization and military expansion, it asserted its influence. By the 1930s, Japan's imperial ambitions clashed with the interests of Western powers. Among these, the United States sought to maintain its influence in the Pacific. In 1937, Japan's invasion of China began its aggressive campaign for territorial control. This conflict brought atrocities, including the infamous Nanking Massacre. The international community condemned Japan's actions. In response, the United States imposed economic sanctions. Vital resources like oil and steel were cut off. For Japan, these sanctions were crippling. Its military and industrial capabilities were under threat. The Japanese government saw the sanctions as an existential crisis, and so they began to prepare for war. On December 7, 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. This devastating strike crippled the US Pacific Fleet in Hawaii. The goal? Eliminate American naval power in the Pacific. This would give Japan free rein to expand its empire. While the attack dealt a significant blow, it galvanized the United States. Within days, America declared war on Japan. This marked the nation's full entry into World War II. After Pearl Harbor, Japan's military advanced rapidly. Territories like the Philippines, Singapore, and parts of Indonesia fell to their forces. The Japanese seemed unstoppable, dominating the Pacific with unrelenting campaigns. But in May 1942, cracks began to show. The Battle of the Coral Sea became a turning point. This costly engagement marked the first time Japan's expansion was checked. The United States stopped Japan from capturing Port Moresby in New Guinea. This preserved a critical Allied position. Despite this setback, Japan remained confident. Its military leaders, particularly Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, planned a decisive battle. Yamamoto's strategy was ambitious. He aimed to lure the US fleet into a trap by attacking Midway Atoll. Midway was remote but strategically vital. Its proximity to Hawaii made it a key target. If captured, Midway would allow Japan to extend its defensive perimeter. It might even threaten the American mainland. Unbeknownst to the Japanese, the United States had a crucial advantage. American cryptographers, led by Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort, had broken Japan's naval codes. Through intercepted communications, US intelligence uncovered the plan. The attack on Midway, codenamed Operation MI, was no longer a secret. Armed with this knowledge, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz took action. As commander of the US Pacific Fleet, he devised a bold counter-strategy. Rather than falling into Yamamoto's trap, Nimitz planned to ambush the Japanese fleet. In preparation, Nimitz assembled his forces. The US Navy had 3 carriers available: USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and USS Yorktown. The Yorktown, damaged during the Battle of the Coral Sea, was a critical piece. Repaired in record time, it returned to action just in time for the fight. These carriers, along with their escorts and aircraft, represented America's best hope. This was their chance to turn the tide in the Pacific. On the morning of June 4th, 1942, the battle began. Japanese aircraft launched waves of attacks on Midway Atoll. Bombs rained down, targeting airstrips and defences. The defenders, though heavily outnumbered, fought valiantly. Anti-aircraft fire and fighter planes took a toll on the attackers. Yet Midway suffered significant damage. Even so, the Japanese failed to achieve their primary goal, neutralising Midway's air power. As the Japanese prepared for a second wave, the Americans struck back. Carrier-based aircraft launched a bold counterattack. The first waves of US torpedo bombers faced devastating losses. Their slow, outdated planes were no match for the agile Japanese Zero fighters. Many brave crews were lost. but their sacrifice distracted the Japanese defences. This left the enemy fleet vulnerable. At a critical moment, American dive bombers arrived. They found the Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga and Soryu, completely exposed. The ships were refueling and rearming planes. Their decks were crowded with explosives. The American bombers struck with devastating precision. Direct hits ignited explosions and fires. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were consumed by flames. This was a catastrophic blow to Japan's naval power. The fourth Japanese carrier, Hiryu, launched a counterstrike. It managed to severely damage the USS Yorktown, but the Americans regrouped quickly. They launched a final attack, sinking Hiryu by the end of the day. All 4 Japanese carriers were destroyed. This marked a turning point, not just in the battle, but in the war itself. The fighting continued for several days. The Japanese attempted to regroup and retreat. By June 7th, it was over. The United States had achieved a decisive victory. Japan's primary carriers were sunk. Their ability to project power in the Pacific was crippled. The loss was catastrophic for Japan. Over 3,000 sailors and airmen were killed. Their fleet suffered irreparable damage. The Battle of Midway marked a turning point. Japan, once seemingly invincible, was now on the defensive. The United States began a bold campaign of island hopping. Strategic locations were captured one by one. Step by step, they pushed closer to Japan. Midway reshaped the nature of naval warfare. The battle proved the central role of aircraft carriers. It signaled the end of the battleship era. Beyond its strategic significance, Midway is remembered for its human cost. The courage of American pilots was extraordinary. They faced overwhelming odds with determination. The resilience of sailors aboard the Yorktown and other ships was inspiring. Their sacrifices showed the strength of the human spirit, even in the face of adversity. Today, Midway Atoll is a wildlife refuge. Its calm waters and quiet shores stand in contrast to the chaos it once endured. This peaceful place is a testament to those sacrifices. It reminds us of the price paid for peace. The story of Midway teaches us many things: the power of strategy, the importance of intelligence, and the unity needed to overcome the greatest challenges. As you rest tonight, reflect on this story. Picture the vast Pacific Ocean. Imagine its waves, now peaceful and still. Think of the bravery of those who fought for a brighter future. Let their sacrifices bring you calm and hope. The impact of Midway did not end with the sinking of Japan's carriers. Its effects echoed across the Pacific and beyond. For Japan, the loss was a strategic disaster. 4 carriers were destroyed: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These ships were the core of the Imperial Japanese Navy's striking force. Their destruction ended Japan's ability to conduct large-scale offensives. The loss of experienced pilots and aircrew was another blow. Unlike the United States, Japan struggled to replace its forces. Its industrial capacity and training programs were limited. The expertise of the aviators lost at Midway was irreplaceable. This left the Japanese fleet at a growing disadvantage in later battles. For the United States, Midway was a game-changer. Victory allowed the US to shift from defense to offense. The Pacific, once dominated by Japan, began to change. American morale soared. The victory proved Japan's expansion could be halted and reversed. For the first time, the Allies had a clear path forward. The island-hopping strategy followed soon after. Allied forces targeted key Japanese-held islands. They bypassed heavily fortified positions, choosing strategic locations instead. Each island captured brought the Allies closer to Japan's home islands. Japanese supply lines were cut off, isolating their forces. One of the first campaigns to build on Midway's success was the Battle for Guadalcanal, which began in August 1942. This grueling 6-month campaign saw the United States gain its first major foothold in the Pacific. It marked the beginning of Japan's long retreat. The lessons learned at Midway, particularly the importance of air superiority in carrier-based operations, were applied repeatedly in the battles that followed. The psychological impact of Midway was equally profound. For Japan, the defeat shattered the aura of invincibility that had surrounded its navy. The loss of the carriers that had spearheaded the attack on Pearl Harbor was a blow. It was a blow not only to Japan's military capabilities, but also to its national pride. The morale of Japanese troops and citizens began to waver. The realization set in, victory might not be achievable. For the United States and its allies, Midway was a source of inspiration and determination. The victory demonstrated that careful planning, intelligence, and courage could overcome even the most formidable adversaries. It strengthened the resolve of Allied forces and galvanized the American public, who now saw a path to ultimate victory in the Pacific. The Battle of Midway also highlighted the evolving nature of naval warfare. The era of the battleship, long considered the dominant force in naval strategy, was over. Midway confirmed that aircraft carriers and their air groups were the new kings of the sea. Control of the skies became the determining factor in naval engagements. This shift would influence military doctrine for decades to come. The role of intelligence in the battle cannot be overstated. The work of American codebreakers, who deciphered Japan's naval plans, provided a critical advantage. This allowed the United States to prepare and execute its ambush. This achievement underscored the importance of information and communication in modern warfare. It set the stage for the development of sophisticated intelligence operations in future conflicts. As the war progressed, the impact of Midway became increasingly evident. The Japanese Navy, once a dominant force, found itself unable to mount large-scale operations. Meanwhile, the United States, with its unmatched industrial capacity, continued to build and deploy new carriers, planes, and ships. By 1944, the balance of power in the Pacific had shifted decisively in favor of the Allies. Today, the story of Midway is remembered not just as a battle. It is a testament to the resilience, ingenuity, and bravery of those who fought there. It serves as a reminder of the sacrifices made by the greatest generation, and the lessons of courage, strategy, and unity that shaped the outcome of the war. The site of the battle, Midway Atoll, is now a place of peace and reflection. Designated as a national wildlife refuge, it is home to a rich diversity of marine and bird life. A far cry from the chaos of war that once engulfed its waters, the atoll stands as a symbol of renewal and a tribute to the resilience of nature and humanity alike. As you reflect on the events of the Battle of Midway, imagine the vast, quiet expanse of the Pacific, its waters calm and still under a starry sky. Let the courage and determination of those who fought fill you with a sense of gratitude and inspiration. Their sacrifices remind us of the strength and resilience within each of us and the enduring hope for peace. After the decisive American victory at Midway, the Imperial Japanese Navy found itself in a precarious position. With the loss of 4 carriers, over 300 aircraft, and their experienced crews, Japan's ability to project power across the Pacific was irreparably weakened. The battle also exposed critical flaws in Japan's strategic planning and overconfidence. Despite early successes in the war, the Japanese High Command underestimated the United States' industrial capacity, intelligence capabilities, and the sheer determination of its forces. Midway was a psychological blow to Japan. The once dominant Japanese Navy now faced a growing and increasingly confident American fleet. This loss of momentum had a cascading effect on Japanese strategy. Without the naval supremacy they had relied upon, Japan was forced into a defensive posture, scrambling to protect its remaining territories and resources. Meanwhile, the United States capitalized on its victory to push forward with its island-hopping campaign. This strategy involved bypassing heavily fortified Japanese strongholds in favor of capturing strategically significant islands. Each island seized became a stepping stone toward Japan itself, providing bases for air operations, supply lines, and staging areas for future assaults. One of the first major campaigns following Midway was the Battle for Guadalcanal, which began in August 1942. Guadalcanal was a grueling and protracted campaign, lasting 6 months and testing the endurance of both American and Japanese forces. The lessons learned at Midway played a crucial role in this battle, particularly the importance of air superiority and naval coordination. Guadalcanal marked the first significant offensive by Allied forces in the Pacific and further demonstrated Japan's inability to sustain its initial advances. The importance of logistics and industrial capacity, highlighted by Midway, became even more apparent as the war progressed. The United States, with its vast industrial resources, was able to replace ships, aircraft, and personnel at a pace that Japan could not match. For every carrier Japan lost at Midway, the US was building multiple new carriers, along with the planes and crews needed to operate them. This overwhelming production capacity allowed the Allies to maintain pressure on Japan across multiple fronts. The Battle of Midway also influenced the development of naval warfare tactics and technology. The battle demonstrated the importance of aircraft carriers as the centerpiece of naval strategy, relegating battleships to a secondary role. The lessons learned at Midway shaped the way future naval engagements were fought, with an emphasis on air power, intelligence, and mobility. Intelligence gathering, which had played such a pivotal role at Midway, continued to be a critical factor in the Allied war effort. The success of American cryptographers in breaking Japanese codes allowed the US to anticipate and counter Japanese moves throughout the war. This advantage helped secure victories in battles such as the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf, further eroding Japan's ability to wage war. As the war drew closer to Japan's home islands, the effects of Midway became even more pronounced. The loss of carriers and pilots at Midway created a gap in Japan's naval and air capabilities that it could never fully close. By the time of the Battle of the Philippine Sea in 1944, often referred to as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Japanese pilots were so inexperienced that American forces decimated them with relative ease. This imbalance in skill and resources can be traced back to the setbacks Japan suffered at Midway. The legacy of Midway extends beyond its military and strategic implications. It became a symbol of resilience, ingenuity, and the importance of unity in the face of adversity. For the United States, the victory at Midway represented a turning point in a war that had begun with the devastating losses at Pearl Harbor. It demonstrated that the American spirit, coupled with innovation and strategy, could overcome even the most formidable challenges. The men who fought at Midway left a lasting impact on history. Their courage and sacrifice are remembered not just in the annals of military history, but also in the hearts of those who understand the profound cost of war. Many of the pilots, sailors, and officers who served in the battle went on to play key roles in subsequent campaigns, carrying with them the lessons and experiences of Midway. Today, the site of the battle remains a place of quiet reflection. Midway Atoll, now a national wildlife refuge, is home to diverse marine and bird life, a stark contrast to the chaos that once engulfed its waters. The peaceful serenity of the atoll serves as a poignant reminder of the cost of war and the enduring hope for peace. The story of Midway is one of triumph and tragedy, of strategy and sacrifice. It is a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit and the importance of standing firm in the face of adversity. As we reflect on this pivotal moment in history, let us remember the bravery of those who fought, the lessons they taught us, and the enduring legacy of their actions. Picture the calm waters of the Pacific, the waves gently lapping against the shores of the atoll. Imagine the bravery of those who took to the skies and seas, their sacrifices shaping the course of history. Let their legacy remind you of the strength and resilience within us all. Thank you for joining us tonight on History and Sleep. May the story of the Battle of Midway bring you reflection, perspective, and a deep sense of gratitude. Sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with the quiet strength of those who came before us, and the enduring hope for a better world. Sweet dreams, and drift off to sleep with rain.